Artists aren't always the best people, and one of the biggest questions in literature, and by extension art, is whether we can separate the art from the artist, whether we can let the art stand on its own, speak for itself, be its own separate entity. Hi, I'm Celine, welcome back to my channel. This is my second ever video essay. I have a microphone, I feel unstoppable. I love doing these, I love writing these essays, and you guys love the other one so much that I thought it was definitely time for me to write the next one. So I'm going to be exploring the age-old question. It is by no way a new discussion, but is definitely far more on the rise now that we have social media, that we have access to everything, that we know a lot more about artists and authors. I'm going to be focusing more specifically on literature because that is my field of study. That is what I believe myself to be most equipped to talk about. However, every single thing I say in this video essay, in this discussion, can be entirely applicable to every mode of art whatsoever. As always, if you see me looking off screen, off camera, I am probably reading a direct quote or reading something that I once said exactly how I wrote it, so just forgive me. While this discussion has been permeating all spheres of art whatsoever, I do believe it requires a far more nuanced approach. My instinctual argument is that you absolutely cannot separate the two, that the art and the artist hold hands and remain inseparable to the very end of the experience of you consuming that art. But I believe in order to actually have a good, substantial, progressive conversation, we have to take a less absolutist approach, at the very least to understand what we want to say before making our argument. That's not to say that there are two incredibly valid sides to this argument and it's impossible to take a stance, but rather to say that you should not, as a person, take a stance on an argument before at the very least listening to the opposition. Before exploring this properly, I believe we need to shift the question a little bit. Rather than asking whether we can separate art from artist, we need to be asking whether we should. This difference in language, this different use of a word, consequently changes the meaning of a sentence in a way that is necessary. Asking whether we can do something is a non-question, an almost silly one, a question that is too difficult to answer because it relies entirely on a consumer's ability to do a thing. Asking, however, whether we should shifts the narrative. You may be able to do something and know in your mind that you shouldn't. And the same is equally true for the opposite. You may be incapable of doing something. You may not know how to do something, but you know that it is a thing you have to learn how to do. I am of the personal belief that arguing for the separation of art from artist is simply a fancy, almost pretentious way of proving your ambivalence towards other people, proving that you don't care about the plight of others for the sake of your own enjoyment. That this idea that because someone hasn't directly and personally affected you, then you reserve the right to forgive them for what they've done on other people's behalf, and I don't agree with it. But in order for me to make that point without sounding rigid, without sounding accusatory, without, as I said, sounding absolutist, I have to, for the sake of the argument, show both sides, show that I understand where people are coming from. There is always going to be validity in some part of someone else's argument, and pretending like there isn't is truly pulling yourself up short and making your argument slightly weaker. So I feel like it's important for us to discuss these two things, especially in a conversation that is as complicated as this one. So that being said, how do we define separating the art from the artist? One of the pioneering leaders in this discussion is French philosopher and essayist Roland Barthes, who in his essay Death of the Author argues that once a work is written, the author's intention, biography, and identity no longer matter when interpreting the text. He says, and I quote, "The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. That literature is the oblique into which every subject escapes, the trap where all identity is lost, beginning with the very identity of the body that writes it." By which he means writing is void. He means it is a space in which the author dies and we cannot know for certain who is speaking, that readers must have their own autonomy, must decide what the text means based on their own analytical interpretation of that text. I remember the first time I read this essay and the first time I read this quote, I was 18 years old in my first year of university and I was blown away. Nothing had ever sounded so beautiful, so intellectual to me. I felt as a reader, as a literature student, important. Like the only thing that ever mattered was my mind and how I chose to use it, how I chose to engage with a text, that the meaning of a text was entirely rooted in my personal critical understanding of it. In essence, no one could touch me, no one could come for me, no one could tell me I was wrong because it was my personal interpretation, it was my personal understanding. What I said was gospel and I loved it. Until the semester ended and I read Michel Foucault's What is an Author? I felt my brain chemistry shift a little bit when I read this. He takes Barthes' argument about the author being dead and he asks the question, all right, let's say the author is dead. Who replaces them? Who replaces the dead author? What stands in this empty space where an author is meant to be? Better yet, Foucault actually stands and points and laughs at Barthes, saying, brother, like, okay, cute argument, cute idea and all, but the author didn't die. They just put a blazer on and went to prison for what they did. His essay champions that the author is not an indefinite source of significations which fill a work, and the author does not precede the works, essentially arguing that the author is not some genius oracle, not some pillar upon which we define art, that they are much more of a function within the text as they are within society, that their very position as an author is shaped by power, by privilege, by control, not just their talent. To which I say, period. This, by the way, could inexplicably be linked back to the conversation that has always been had within our communities, but was recently revisited following the US elections about whether or not reading is political, which by my argument, by my definition, and in connection by Foucault's argument, it is always political. So these two essays shape the trajectory of these discussions and are a fantastic starting point for our arguments. Barthes wanted to free the text of the author, whereas Foucault reminded us that authorship itself is a system, and systems do not die just because we pretend they don't exist. You can kill the author all you like, but their name remains on the syllabus. Their names keep selling books. They keep determining what counts as literature, which is why it's so important for us to have these conversations. A phenomenal example of this is the poignancy of Oscar Wilde, who is inexplicably, inarguably, a crucial part of the two sides debate. A little history on Oscar Wilde. In 1895, Wilde was tried in court for gross indecency, aka being gay. He was being publicly scrutinized and thus punished for engaging in sodomy. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that during the trial, a lot of people came to testify against him to help get him imprisoned. And many of the people who testified against him were aged 14 and under. They were boys under the age of 14, what we now consider to be minors. Considering, however, that the age of consent in England at the time was 13, the trial in no way focused on their ages, just their genders. Had he been sleeping with 14-year-old girls, no issue would have ever been raised, which calls to question another discussion that needs to be had about the question of legality and morality and what can be linked to the other, whether something being legal makes it inherently moral and whether it should make it inherently moral. But that's neither here nor there for this specific point that I'm making now. Nevertheless, Wilde was eventually imprisoned. He was eventually jailed for what he did and publicly scrutinized for his queerness, not for the age difference. And following his imprisonment, towards the end of his life, when he was 44 years old, he took a 15-year-old boy and engaged in a very, very long sexual and romantic relationship with this boy until the end of his life. Again, this age difference was not uncommon in heterosexual spheres. The issue for a lot of people was the queerness, not the age. But we are looking at this from 2025. Now, knowing this at the time that we do and looking at it from our societal context, do we cancel Oscar Wilde? Do we remove him from the syllabus? Do we stop studying his work? Do we stop looking at the influence of his work? Do we erase his queerness from the story? Do we ignore these age gaps and these strange, uncomfortable relationships that we were having? A question I will answer a little later in this conversation. But to answer this question, we have to be looking at the arguments for and against separating the art from the artists. Many who argue in favor of the separation do so on the basis of a few things. The first being the foundation of a thing called new criticism. This is a literary theory movement that supports Roland Barthes' argument that the text is everything. Nothing else matters as long as it's just the text. It supports the idea that we absolutely can and should separate art from artist because the author's identity isn't part of the interpretation or the conversation. With this in mind, however, what happens when ignoring the author means also ignoring the core of much of their work? To strip Wilde's queerness from his work is to miss the very things he risked his life for. To strip James Baldwin's lived experiences as a black gay man is to ignore the impact of his work, to diminish the power of his writing, the risk, the bravery, the meaning behind every single word he put on paper. So it's a conversation that needs to be had. Sure, you want to say that you need to ignore these things. You want to say that the text matters on its own. But what happens when the text is entirely rooted in the author? The next argument in favor of separating art from artist, pushes forth the necessity of timeless value. It notes that great literature transcends its creator, that people still to this day read Homer, they still read Shakespeare without knowing anything really about their personal lives. And the reason I love having this debate and having this conversation with as much nuance as possible is because despite the fact that I am on the other side of the conversation, despite the fact that I don't believe we can separate the art from the artist, I actually really agree with this point that's being made. I really agree that time and timelines and context really matters to this discussion. But my agreeing with this is actually what plays a massive role in me eventually coming to the conclusion that we can't separate it. A final defense of their argument is the case for preserving the influence of art, that if we cancelled every artist, every author we didn't agree with, every artist that thought things in a way that we didn't like, we wouldn't have any artists left. All monuments of art would be lost to us. Now, while a little less passionately, I in some way could be convinced to agree with this argument, but it's not convincing enough. Because to me, this argument suggests that these authors who are at the forefront of literature are the only authors to have ever had an impact on literature, when really you could argue that they're just the only authors who were given a platform, the only authors whose work was actually championed at the time of their publication. Now, in opposition to these arguments, the first thing I and many would argue is that context adds depth, that understanding the author is a necessary part of better engaging with their text, that knowing Baldwin makes reading Giovanni's Room a lot more important, makes questioning why the characters in Giovanni's Room are not black, why they're not people of color, but they are queer, makes you understanding the structures behind these stories far more enjoyable and important. You know, you want to know who the author is, because if I wanted to pick up a book about social theory and how to navigate society, and I found out that the author was a Nazi, I don't actually want their advice. I actually don't care what they think about how society should be navigated. Do you see what I mean? Like, sometimes people may sound intelligent. They may sound like they have something good to say, but if they are inherently bad people and their cruelty, their evilness is reflective of their lack of intellect, they are not people that you need to look for. They are not people that you should be engaging with. Now, sure, you can argue that if we cancel all authors, if we cancel everyone we disagree with, then we do lose authors. But I counter that with everything has to be put into its proper context. That time is everything. Yes, Wilde did sleep with minors, but at the time were they considered minors? And this is in no way a defense of what he did. It is in no way a defense of the act, and certainly not an argument for the morality of what he did just because of its legality, but a necessary observation. Cancelling Wilde in 2025 for crimes committed over a century ago would be useless, not just because of the time and not because the crimes aren't things that should be punished or held to account, but because the author is literally dead. Not literally, literally dead. The author does not benefit from our conversations. He does not benefit from our support. He is not fiscally and societally celebrated as he would if he was alive, if we are discussing their work. But funnily enough, this is not a case of separating art from artists. Relating older artists to this argument is kind of like, yes, sure, you're making a point, I guess, but it means nothing because it's not relevant to the context we're discussing this in. They don't receive that support. Engaging with the likes of someone like Oscar Wilde can be done in a crucial manner and can be done without supporting him, because he isn't alive. You can enjoy art, you can study its significance, and still remain cognizant of the fact that the artist did bad things, inexcusable things. But because they are dead, your engaging with their work in no way benefits them. In fact, choosing to engage with the work with critical understanding of their context makes your consumption of it far more worthwhile, far more nuanced, and far more engaging. We as readers, however, have a moral responsibility to remain knowledgeable, and this knowledge is what guides us towards understanding the true scope of the art. That being said, the argument grows a lot less nuanced as we approach modern day. When we ask the question now about present and thriving artists, we are placing the question within our societal context, within what we know now to be right and wrong, and what the authors know now to be right and wrong. Authors today cannot be excused for things authors of yesterday would have been. They have no contextual basis behind which to hide their misdemeanors. Literature is made of language, which is soaked in worldview, values, assumptions, and thus, as Foucault notes, the writer is always present in their work. You may take a pair of scissors and cut their name from the book, but that doesn't take away the fact that they wrote it, that they are present in the story. So then, within today's context, should we separate the art from the artist? No. Take J.K. Rowling as a prime example of this. The Harry Potter series is a pillar in its genre. It was monumental. It was influential. It changed the sphere. Harry Potter is part of the reason young adult exists as a separate category when you walk into bookstores. However, JKR is an objectively terrible person. So your public verbal fiscal support of her inevitably pushes her awfulness forward, and in some ways argues that you don't care how awful she is because she's not awful to you directly. Every time you convince someone to buy her book, every time you buy merch, every time you engage with her work, you line the pockets of someone who will use that money to hurt someone else. And even if she wasn't financially dominating with your support, it calls to question what your alignment with her work means. The media that we consume becomes a part of us. There is no denying this. What we consume and what we engage with becomes a facet by which we are perceived. So what does it mean when we are engaging with someone who does not align with us? When a writer's actions completely contradict your values and your belief system, why do you engage with their work? The unfortunate reality is that art does not exist in a vacuum. Everything is connected to everything, and to pretend otherwise is to be willfully ignorant. For many people, books like Harry Potter defined their childhood. They harbor a sense of warm nostalgia, and no one is taking this away from you. I think many people calling for the separation of art from artists do so because they feel their personal connections being attacked and judged. If you want to read J.K. Rowling, read J.K. Rowling. That's your prerogative. I'm not here to tell you not to do that. I'm not here to tell you not to read these books. I am here to tell you the right way within the sphere of this argument to engage with this media. If you want to read these books, buy them secondhand, pirate them online, borrow them from a friend, get them at a charity shop. Just don't put money in this woman's pocket. Don't publicly promote this book. Don't talk about how much you love it. Because then when someone reads it because of your recommendation, when someone buys this book because of your recommendation, they are lining her pockets. This then, however, begs a new question, which is, must we now ignore all forms of art because we don't agree with the artist? Must we ignore good art because the artist is bad? But I counter it with a suggestion that if an artist's personal life is louder and more prominent than their art, then their art isn't actually that good and not worth ignoring their personal life for. The progress we've made through society and how society has changed in our time has also changed how we perceive and consume media, both for the better and for the worse interchangeably. The progress we have made as a society has changed the way we perceive and consume media, both for the better and the worse interchangeably. But this constant need, this constant push to separate the artist, to kill the presence of the artist in their art, is going to fundamentally spiral into more acceptance and more normalcy of AI-driven art drivel, of AI books, AI poetry, AI stories, which just it just should not be happening. We shouldn't be doing this. The more disconnected we become from artists, the more disconnected we become from the importance of the significance of an artist and their presence in a text, the more willing we are going to become to accepting machine-driven art. That sentence alone is truly sickening. Sure, a machine can create art, but it can't create art. You know what I mean? Every book has a heartbeat to it. Every book has a palpable spirit in it, the presence of which makes the author known. Even if the author isn't putting their mind into it, even if they aren't putting their opinion into it, there is a certain tone, a certain style, a certain love of the work that bleeds from an author into the work. And when you take that away, when you convince us that the author's presence isn't necessary, what will be left? You take the author away, you take away the heartbeat of the story, you kill the author and you kill the meaningfulness, you kill what makes writing as beautiful as it is. So what then is the answer? Should we separate the two? The short answer is no. The long answer is that our decisions must be entirely determined by the context we speak in. If the author is not around to benefit, it is perhaps less imperative that we keep them bound to one another. It is perhaps more acceptable to separate them. Sure, what they did was maybe acceptable at the time, and while we morally will not accept it, We can't punish them 300 years later for it. We can still acknowledge, we can still be cognizant of the fact that what they did was wrong, but we can still engage with their texts because they don't benefit anything from it. We don't engage with their texts in the sense that we agree with what they say. When we engage with these authors' texts, when we engage with these artists, we must be aware. We must make it clear that we are looking at this from a critical perspective, that we understand what they did was wrong and we are separating them. But the only reason separating them is acceptable is because they don't exist anymore. But then you come with the counter argument of, yes, they're dead. Yes, we can look at it critically. Yes, we can be cognizant of their crimes, of their behavior. But then erasing them from the story loses meaning of the story. Thus, the most meaningful, the most critical, the most useful decision should always be to remain interconnected with author and art. In order to truly accurately engage with the text, in order to get absolutely everything you can out of a piece of literature, you unfortunately have to engage with the author. Yes, it's a nuanced discussion. Yes, it's a critical discussion. Yes, there are exceptions, there are anomalies to these conversations. But in the wider sphere of things, on a more absolutist frame, you cannot separate the art from the artist, especially if the author is alive. You must not line their pockets. You must not gild their names and bring them to such a high standing in society that they can do what they want and be as heinous and as hateful and as cruel as they want and get away with it because we've glazed them, basically. In conclusion, you should not separate the art from the artist, both for the integrity of the story itself and also for maintaining the safety and the comfort and the intersectionality of your peers. That is the end of this essay. I actually really enjoyed writing this because this is a topic of conversation I am having all the time. I'm always discussing it and I had so much fun, but I want to do so many more of these. So if you have any ideas of something you'd like for me to speak about, please leave it in the comment section below. Please let me know. You can leave it here. You can DM me on Instagram. You can DM me on TikTok. You can message me on Substack. Just any of these platforms that I have. Please let me know something that you'd like me to talk about. And if it's something that piques my interest, I definitely will, because I love writing essays and I love talking about things that I care about, and I'm just so grateful for this platform. I don't know why, I just got really sentimental. Anyway, bye.